Hello, welcome to Membo's weekly review show. I'm video producer Osman Butt, filling in for this week for our regular host Nasim Ahmed, who will be returning to the show next week. As usual, joining us is Moin Rabani. Moin, welcome,
Thank you very much, Osman. It's a pleasure to be with you.
and it's our pleasure to have you. This week, we discuss Israel's twin assassinations in Lebanon and Iran, targeting Hezbollah commander Faoud Shakur and Hamas's political chief Ismail Haniyeh. The killings last week have sparked fears of a major regional escalation, as well as a derailing of the ceasefire negotiations. As we record this episode on Monday, the 5th of August, the world is waiting for an Iranian retaliation to last week's strike. But at this time of recording, it has not yet occurred. With this in mind, we will be assessing the potential impact. Also on today's show, as Al Jazeera's journalist and as Al Jazeera journalist Ismail Al-Ghul and his cameraman Rami Al-Rafi are killed in an Israeli strike, we will look at the significance of these deaths. We will also examine why Israel is ramping up its attacks on schools and hospitals in Gaza. And lastly, the Gazan Health Ministry has updated its death toll to 39,623. But are all the bodies being counted? So, Moin, let us begin with the big story from last week. As much of our audience will no doubt be aware, there were at least two assassinations that occurred within a few hours of each other. One in Beirut, targeting Faoud Shakur, and another one a few hours later, targeting Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. One's obviously a Hezbollah commander, and the other is the political chief in Hamas. So, what exactly do we know about last week's strikes?
Well, let me start by saying in your introductory comments, you referred to fears of a full-scale regional conflagration and fears that these assassinations would derail negotiations for a ceasefire. I think that's true for most people. But there are others who have not fear, but hope that this will lead to a full-scale regional conflagration and hope that this will definitively derail the ceasefire negotiations. And I think it's important to keep that in mind as we discuss this issue. So, what happened last week is that Israel first launched an air raid on the southern suburbs of Beirut and managed to successfully assassinate Fuad Shukr, the senior Hezbollah military commander. And he wasn't just any commander. He was, along with Ahmad Moghniya and Mustafa Badruddin, two senior Hezbollah military commanders who were assassinated in 2008 and then a few years ago, respectively, considered the three founding members of the first generation, if you will, of the Islamic resistance, the military arm of Hezbollah. And if we look at the pattern of clashes between Israel and Hezbollah since October 8th of last year, when Hezbollah launched its so-called support front in southern Lebanon, this exceeded the existing rules of engagement, such as they are, in significant ways. And these were enumerated by the Hezbollah General Secretary, Hassan Nasrallah. It was an attack in the Lebanese capital, Beirut. It was an attack in a residential area of Beirut, and it was an attack on a very senior Hezbollah leader. And Nasrallah made clear that there would be a reprisal by Hezbollah to this attack, and that it would neither be indirect nor symbolic, but would be a reprisal that has similar strategic significance. And he left us completely in the dark about what that might be. I would say deliberately so. Then 12 hours later, the head of the Hamas Politburo, Ismail Haniyeh, was assassinated. And I think just as important as the fact of his assassination is the fact that the assassination took place in the Iranian capital, Tehran, while he was an official guest of the Iranian government attending the inauguration of the new Iranian president, Pezeshkian, if I pronounced that correctly, a few days earlier, and was staying at a guest house that is operated by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. And the Iranian response, at least what they have stated so far, has been no less unambiguous than that of Hezbollah. And what the Iranians are basically saying is that in April, the Israelis bombed an Iranian diplomatic facility in the Syrian capital, Damascus. The Iranians responded with the first direct attack since 1979 from Iranian territory onto Israeli territory. And as most observers have concluded, that that salvo of drones and missiles was deliberately calibrated to, on the one hand, send a clear message to Israel, don't do this again, but at the same time to produce only limited damage so that there would be no further escalation. And so, while the world thought it was on the brink of another full-scale Middle East war in April, the nature of the Iranian reprisal to the Israeli attack on the Iranian facility in Damascus and Israel's subsequent limited response to that reprisal pulled us back from the brink. And what the Iranians are now saying is that our response in April had a primary purpose, which was to deter Israel from undertaking such attacks again. Well, what has Israel done now? It has not just attacked an Iranian diplomatic facility abroad, but it has attacked in Iran, Tehran, the Iranian capital. It has, in doing so, killed an important guest of the Iranian government. And so, what the Iranians are saying is not only are we going to respond, but we are this time going to respond much more powerfully in order to clearly deter Israel from undertaking similar attacks in the future. We're now speaking on Monday, August 5th, at a time when neither Hezbollah nor Iran have yet launched their anticipated reprisals for these twin attacks. So at this point, we do not know if there will indeed be an attack, although that seems 99.99% certain. We do not yet know the nature of that attack in the sense of will it be a coordinated attack by Hezbollah, Iran, and other members of the self-styled axis of resistance, or will it be a series of separate attacks? Nor do we know what exactly they will do. My suspicion is that what Iran and Hezbollah and their coalition partners would like to do would be to attack Israel in a way that if it does not respond, it will appear weak and deterred. And if it does respond, then it would be an Israeli responsibility for the further escalation that takes place. And here I would just like to refer to the Lebanese analyst Ali Haidar speaking on one of the Arab satellite channels a few days ago. He said, the fundamental issue here is that neither Iran nor Israel nor Hezbollah want a full-scale war, but in defending what they perceive as their vital interests, they are prepared to risk a war in order to defend those interests. And the Iranians have said as much. Those who are now calling for restraint should have been calling for restraint before the situation got out of hand. And we are now going to take measures to ensure that Israel conducts itself in a more restrained manner in future. And if that leads to a war, um, that is not our responsibility, and so be it, is effectively what they're saying.
Indeed. And obviously, we're still, as you've said, we're still sort of waiting to see what might happen. But of course, so before we sort of get to the sort of wider potential impact of this, I'd like to take a moment to focus a little bit on the two figures that were assassinated last week, Fawad Shakur and Ismail Haniya. I mean, Haniya, if we start with him, he's been a very important figure within Hamas for a long time, many decades. He was briefly prime minister of the PA in 2006 to 2007 and was ousted in part by that 2007 fight between Hamas and Fatah. And he essentially was, effectively de facto prime minister of Gaza up until I think 2017. And he's when Yahya Sinwar replaced him, and he's been, part of the committee, the political committee for Hamas, based mostly in Doha, up until sort of now. But how important was Hania? Not so much just in the past, but how much was he going to be important going forward? Because as you might have seen, some Israeli analysts have been saying he was being prepared to become PM, Prime Minister again.
I don't agree with that last statement, and I'll get to why I don't think that was a realistic supposition in a moment. But first, about these two who have been assassinated. Fuad Shukr of Hezbollah, we've already discussed. So he was an absolutely central figure in the Islamic resistance, the military wing of the Hezbollah movement. As far as Ismail Haniya is concerned, he goes way back in terms of his involvement in Hamas. He first rose to prominence as essentially the personal assistant of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the founding leader of Hamas, who you may recall was a paraplegic, and it was always Ismail Haniya who was pushing him around in his wheelchair, arranging his meetings, and so on. So he was very much his private assistant. And then in and Yassin, of course, was assassinated by Israel in the Gaza Strip in 2004. Haniya, a refugee who hails from the Shatit Beach refugee camp in the Gaza Strip, subsequently rose to prominence in 2006 as the leader of the slate of candidates Hamas put forward when it essentially reversed its decision on participation in Palestinian Authority elections and contested the 2006 Palestinian Legislative Council elections in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. At the time, the view that was put forward was that Haniya was very much a consensus candidate within Hamas, and he seems to also have been a consensus candidate more broadly within Palestinian society, because of course Hamas won those elections with a veto-proof majority, and Haniya was subsequently appointed as the prime minister of the Palestinian Authority. And after the violent schism in June of 2007, Haniya continued as prime minister. But as you noted, he had been dismissed by the leadership of the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, but maintained his role as prime minister of the separate Palestinian Authority in the Gaza Strip. In other words, what's often referred to as the Hamas-run government. And then in 2017, he was elected as the head of the Hamas Politburo. Now, the position of head of the Hamas Politburo had not been absolutely central to the movement in previous years, because when Sheikh Ahmed Yassin was alive, he was the effective leader, even though he was not the head of the Politburo. And the Politburo was, in fact, initially established by Hamas to be based in exile to ensure the survival and continuation of the movement against the waves of Israeli assassination and repression in the occupied territories. But Hamas has term limits for the head of its Politburo. So in 2017, Khalid Mash'al, his predecessor, stepped down and was replaced by Hania. And interestingly, not long thereafter, Hania relocated from the Gaza Strip to the Qatari capital, Doha. So on the one hand, his election as Politburo chief can be seen as a transfer of the center of gravity and the center of power within the movement to the Gaza Strip, because that was the territory it controlled and ruled. But then at the same time, Hania's relocation to Qatar from the Gaza Strip can also be seen perhaps as something of a diminution of his role, particularly in contrast to Yahya Sinwar, whose official position is not more than the local head of Hamas. In other words, he is the senior official of that branch of Hamas in the Gaza Strip rather than of the movement as a whole, but has emerged as the most powerful and influential leader within the entire movement. And Hania's role was political rather than operational. Of course, the International Criminal Court prosecutor, Karim Khan, was seeking an arrest warrant for him in response to the Hamas attacks on October 7th. Now, of course, there will not be an arrest warrant or a trial. I don't know if there would have been had he survived this attack, but I think it would have been very difficult to make the case that he was directly involved, arguably even aware of the specific planning for those attacks. But nevertheless, he was a central figure in Hamas. His removal from the scene will not, in my view, have a significant operational impact, if you will, on the movement, particularly not on its military posture and capabilities in the Gaza Strip. And I think what's important to recognize here is that while Israel has been very successful at assassinating Palestinian leaders and senior officials and cadres and so on, I mean, within Hamas alone, Yassin was assassinated. Some 40 days later, his successor, Abdulaziz Rantisi, was assassinated. His successor, Khalid Mash'al, barely survived an assassination attempt conducted with chemical agents by the Israeli Mossad intelligence agency on the streets of Amman. And now Mash'al's successor, Hania, has been assassinated as well, to say nothing of all the other Palestinian leaders from various factions. And what we've seen is that while Israel is effective at assassinating individuals and leaders and officials and so on, and in fact has been doing this for decades on a systematic basis, it has been an absolute failure when it comes to actually defeating the movements that these people lead. Hamas is, I think, a very good example of a movement that has lost so many of its key figures and leaders, but in the meantime has only gone from strength to strength. I mean, when Yassin was assassinated, Hamas didn't really have a rocket capability. It had the equivalent of tin cans that could barely make it over the Gaza-Israel boundary. Well, look where it was on October 7th. It didn't rule any territory in 2004. In 2006, it obtained a veto-proof majority in local Palestinian elections in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and has ruled the Gaza Strip since then. So, it's a significant blow. I mean, the killing of any leader is going to be a significant blow any way you cut it. It affects morale, I'm sure, but it will not have, and this is equally true, I think, of previous um, assassinations. It will not have a long-term operational or political or organizational impact on Hamas.
Yes, and it's interesting to think about this because, of course, he wasn't a central figure in the sense that he was running the show in Gaza. And so his assassination doesn't seem to serve any real purpose from the perspective of Israel trying to crush Hamas in Gaza. But obviously, it is an important event and an important symbolic event. So, what do you think in this particular case and in the case of Fawad Shukr? What was Israel's intention here? Why were they carrying out this killing? I mean, obviously, right now we've got Benjamin Netanyahu, who is, according to reports in the Israeli media, sitting in a recently constructed bunker by Shin Bet, waiting for a response. So, what was his plan here? Why did he decide to do this?
Well, I think it had a number of related objectives. You earlier mentioned the Qatari and Egyptian mediated negotiations for a ceasefire. And Hania, of course, had a prominent role in those negotiations. I believe that he was the basically the de facto chief negotiator, or at least the one in charge of the Palestinian negotiating team. Now, if you want negotiations to reach a successful conclusion, um, you you would probably not try to do so by assassinating the other side's chief negotiator. If you do this, you're obviously hoping that the other side will refuse to negotiate further, or that it will lead to some kind of crisis that lead to a breakdown in those negotiations. And anyone who has looked at this, aside from U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, has concluded that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has absolutely no interest in a successful conclusion of these negotiations and has repeatedly gone out of his way to sabotage them and to place new demands and conditions and so on, not in order to achieve more in the negotiations, but in order to obstruct these negotiations and to ensure their failure. It's not only the Palestinians who are saying this. It's not only the Egyptian and Qatari mediators who are saying this. We are now hearing those statements explicitly from senior Israeli politicians, from senior Israeli military and intelligence officials, and from those Netanyahu has selected and assigned to lead Israel in these negotiations. So, unless you're Antony Blinken, this is something that is definitively beyond dispute. I think that was the first objective. What I don't think was happening is what some people have suggested, which is that the U.S. Felt that Netanyahu, or even that Israel felt that it could finally call it a day and end its genocidal campaign on the Gaza Strip only after it had acquired some significant achievements, and that therefore the assassination of Shukr, the assassination of Hania, the almost simultaneous Israeli announcement that a July assassination attempt against the Hamas commander in chief in the Gaza Strip, Mohammed Deif, had been successful, that these gave Israel, let's say, the prerequisites for what they consider a dignified exit, and that so that we should see this in the context of laying the groundwork for a ceasefire agreement, either because Israel has decided upon one, or because the United States is now finally prepared to read the Riot Act to its Israeli proxy and ensure that this war comes to an end. I don't buy any of that. There's absolutely no evidence for it, and we can get into that later because I want to get back to your question about what Israel's objectives were. Well, I already gave you one, which is to sabotage rather than conclude the ceasefire negotiations. And the response from Hamas has been, yes, you did assassinate Hania, but you've also killed some 40,000 Palestinians. We didn't stop negotiating when you killed the other 39,999 Palestinians. So we're not going to stop negotiating just because you killed a prominent leader of our movement. But I think the second and more important objective that Israel is seeking to achieve is to provoke a full-scale regional war. Now, you would legitimately respond by saying, well, Israel is having so much trouble in the Gaza Strip. Why would it possibly now want to unleash a armed confrontation with a much more powerful Hezbollah on a second front, and then in addition open a third front with the conventional army of the Islamic Republic of Iran? And the answer to that is that if you look at what has been happening in the past 10 months, on each and every occasion, the United States has a stated policy of preventing regional escalation, which I believe it genuinely believes. That I do believe Washington genuinely wants to avoid regional escalation. But at the same time, it has consistently enabled Israel to further escalate regionally, and on each and every occasion has jumped to Israel's defense to defend it against the consequences of Israeli actions that produce further regional escalation. And given this pattern, I think Israel now sees what it believes to be perhaps a unique opportunity, something it has been trying to achieve for at least the last decade or two, of provoking a direct military confrontation between the United States and Israel's enemies in the Middle East, chiefly Iran. And so I do think they see this, because I think the Israelis, looking at the pattern over the past 10 months, they understand that while it may be well and true that the United States has sent a clear message to Israel, if you are attacked, we will defend you. But if you initiate a conflict, you're on your own. They know, and the US has already demonstrated by sending additional ships and assets and bombs and all the rest of it, ammunition to Israel. Israel knows damn well that even if it is Israel that initiates and provokes a full-scale regional conflict, that the US will do everything within its power to defend Israel against the repercussions of its actions. Because the fundamental principle, the fundamental American principle here is this: US support for Israel is unconditional. There will never be repercussions or consequences for Israel for anything it does at any time to anyone, anywhere. And the US commitment to Israel's security is ironclad and unconditional. So the only thing that what Israel does, who it does it to, how it does it, is completely irrelevant to US calculations. The only relevant factor for the US is that Israel must be defended at all costs. Now, this puts Israel obviously in a great position today, but in the broader context, we have to remember the nature of the US-Israeli relationship. It's the US that's a superpower, not Israel. It is Israel that is the proxy, not the United States. Israel's role in this relationship is to defend and promote Western interests in the Middle East. And what we're seeing instead is Israel having to be defended by its sponsors and allies against those who it is supposed to keep in their place. And so I think this will have significant long-term um, uh, repercussions on Western strategic perceptions of the value of Israel as a Western proxy in the Middle East, as a state that is not only incapable of defending and promoting Western interests in the Middle East, but that can't even defend itself without these Western powers that would really like to focus on Ukraine, on China, on whatever, having now to divert so much of their time and effort and resources to defending Israel against a war with Iran, potentially, of course, that was initiated not by Tehran, but by Tel Aviv.
Indeed. And what is, because obviously you've talked to us a little bit about what the impact might even be when we think about the future of Western strategic interests as a result of what might, become as a result of all of this. But what has struck you about the international reaction to all of this? I mean, you've mentioned the United States, where Anthony Blinken has effectively, said, well, we don't really know if Israel did this or not, despite every other country thinking otherwise. We have
Yeah.
also seen diplomatic efforts from Jordan and others. So, in the last week, what has struck you most from the international
You know,
response?
if Netanyahu stands up tomorrow before Congress and says, my intelligence agencies have confirmed that the moon is made out of cheese, you will get half of Congress ordering a plain cheese sandwich and the other half putting mustard on their bread, waiting for the Mossad to bring them cheese from the moon. And Blinken is entirely of a piece with this. Um, for Blinken, Israel can do no wrong. I think, I've been criticized for saying this, but I think we have to understand that people like Joe Biden and Anthony Blinken, these are politicians who belong to a certain age when um, anti-Arab racism and particularly anti-Palestinian racism were de rigueur for any successful U.S. Politician or senior official. And it's very, very deeply ingrained in their psyche, in their political soul, in their being. And so the question we need to ask about people like that is not whether they have any pangs of conscience or whether they feel any shame about their role. I think we have to recognize that they're extraordinarily proud of what they're doing. Wouldn't surprise me that for Blinken, the Gaza genocide he considers his finest hour. It wouldn't surprise me at all. I mean, you know, these people look upon Palestinian civilians the same way the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan looks at people like Emmett Till. They're not human beings. When these people see the bodies of dismembered Palestinian children blown to smithereens by US weapons, they don't see dead children. They see a victory against terrorism. That is where these people are coming from. And I think we need to stop pretending that we can in any way appeal to their better instincts or to anything else and finally recognize that they're not doing this because they feel they have no choice. They're not doing this against their better judgment. They are all in. They're doing this out of conviction, and they're extraordinarily proud of of the result. And in the case of someone like Blinken, he at least goes through the motions. But you look at Biden, and he is absolutely unapologetic about it. Absolutely unapologetic. Yes, he's he is his mental capacities appear to be increasingly diminished to the extent that people are now questioning whether or not he is still a sentient being. But on this issue, his faculties are unaffected. Um, I would argue he's not doing this because he's losing capacity, but rather that if Biden was losing his mental capacities, US policy might change for the better. But it is because Biden is so fully in control of himself on this issue. You know, this will probably be the last memory to leave the space between his ears, the last conviction he holds. It is because he is so firmly in control of his capabilities that the policy is of unconditional support for genocide against the Palestinian people is continuing. But I may have skipped over your question in raising that point.
Yes, I was asking about international reaction and what struck
Yes,
you.
sorry. Yeah, getting right back. Well, the international reaction has been as it always has. You know, we don't want escalation. We absolutely don't want a regional war, and I'm sure that they don't want either. And sorry, when we say international reaction, of course, there's a reaction of the international community, which by and large sees this for what it is. And then there is the response of the Western states, which have responded to these developments according to the principles of their rules-based international order. And the principles of the rules-based international order is, that well, since it wasn't Iran that assassinated an Israeli leader, which would have been absolutely outrageous and cause for war, but it was Israel assassinating a Palestinian leader in Iran, that's fine. That's self-defense. We're not going to, the US, Britain, and France blocked a presidential statement about this issue in the UN Security Council. You know, imagine what we haven't even read about that in our newspapers. Imagine if Russia and China had blocked a UN Security Council statement that sought to condemn Iran for, assassinating some leader of a foreign movement in Tel Aviv. So um, the Western response has been, well, we may not like this, okay, but now that it has happened, the same people who have done absolutely nothing to promote, let's call it Israeli restraint for 10 months, but to the contrary, have been providing Israel with weaponry, who have continued on a mass scale to import illegal products from the illegal settlements, who have done absolutely nothing to prevent their own citizens from playing a direct role in the Gaza genocide by serving in the Israeli military, and so on and so forth, who consider it perfectly normal and acceptable for their own citizens to be illegal settlers in illegal settlements. And I could go on, but I won't. Now all of a sudden they have discovered restraint. So they are reaching out to Iran and Hezbollah, primarily indirectly, to urge them not to respond to the Israeli provocations. Well, it's to me absolutely clear that the US at least had foreknowledge of these attacks, if not having been involved in their planning. And you have a situation now where the West felt absolutely no need to impose restraint on Israel, but now considers it essential that Iran and Hezbollah demonstrate restraint. And I think it's partially for this reason that Iran and Hezbollah have basically refused to accept these messages and told the messengers to go to hell. And then, the other part of it is that, yes, the US is so opposed to the prospect of further regional escalation that it is releasing previously reserved weapons to the Israeli armory, that it is, bleeding 24 hours a day about Israel's right to defend itself. It is sending additional forces to the Middle East with the explicit assignment of defending Israel against the consequences of its own actions. It is trying to reconstruct this coalition of Western and regional states to defend Israel against the fallout from its own actions. So, as they say, um, uh, judge me by what I do and not what I say.
Indeed, and Moin, we could spend forever talking about this topic. There's a lot to go through here, whether it's the international response, whether it's more about how the assassination was carried out, the intentions, or whether Biden is sentient or ever achieved sentience. These are all questions that we could ask, but we do need to move on. Because another major and significant event took place last week, and that is the killing of two Al Jazeera employees, one journalist, Ismail Al Ghul, and his cameraman, Rami Al Rafi, who were killed, after an Israeli strike. Aside from obviously the personal tragedy that this is and tragedy for the network, it also marks a grim milestone, as this is likely to be the 120th journalist killed in Gaza, according to the International Federation of Journalists since September, since 7th of October. And so, what what does this sort of killing tell of these journalists? What does this tell us about Israel's targeting of them? And how would you discuss? How should we understand the situation for journalists in the besieged Strip?
Well, I think the first observation to make is that we now have definitive proof that Ismail al-Ghul was um, uh, deliberately assassinated by Israel in a premeditated attack. And how do we know this? Because the Israelis subsequently released a propaganda dossier in which it claimed showed that Ismail al-Ghul was a member of Hamas. I can't remember whether he was a commander of its nuclear submarine fleet or its space force. Um, uh, and this document was clearly a hoax because if this document was genuine, we have to believe several things. First of all, that the Qassam brigades, which is a clandestine armed movement that has never operated publicly in the sense of a conventional force or even the government security force in the Gaza Strip. We're being asked to believe that the Qassam brigades maintain electronic files with the real names, identification numbers, and mugshots of each one of their members. It's, if Hamas or if the Qassam brigades actually maintain such records, trust me, they would no longer exist, because each and every one of their members would have been picked off years before October 7th. October 7th would have never happened, and we wouldn't be having this conversation now. So we can, I think, state definitively that the so-called registry of Qassam members is a hoax. Secondly, you know, Israel has amplified certain columns of Al-Ghul's entry on this supposed registry. But what they didn't translate is that, according to this document, um, he has had a military rank within the Qassam brigades since 2007. Well, he was born in 1997, so he would have been only 10 years old. And even Napoleon and Alexander the Great didn't become active militarily until they were well into their teens. So again, it just defies the imagination. But, Israel knows that it only needs to put this information out there. And there is an entire army of apologists and flunkies who are just waiting, who will uncritically accept and mass regurgitate this haspara, this propaganda, because, they don't think for themselves. They let the military, the spokesperson of the Israeli military and Israeli officials do the thinking for them. And so it's it's quite clearly a deliberate, premeditated assassination. And, part of it, I think, has to do with Israel's increasingly fanatic and hysterical campaign against Al Jazeera. That's certainly the case. There was another Al Jazeera correspondent. I believe his name was Ismail Abu Omar, and the claim, and he was attacked, I believe, by a drone in Rafah this February. He wasn't killed. Israel subsequently put out reports about him, um, that he was the deputy commander of Hamas's Khan Yunis battalion, and as proof, um, uh, put out a clip which purported to show him reporting from beyond the boundary of the Gaza Strip, from somewhere in southern Israel in October 7th. Well, my God, have you ever heard of a correspondent reporting from a scene of a battle? Of course you haven't. Therefore, it proves this guy is a Hamas battalion deputy commander. So, we are to believe that the deputy commander of Hamas's Khan Yunis brigade on October 7th was not dressed in military gear like the rest of the Hamas fighters on that day, was sauntering around southern Israel unarmed in civilian attire and reporting. Really? If Hamas battalion commanders were operating like that, October 7th would have never happened. And then we are supposed to believe that Abu Omar, he was severely wounded in Rafah in February when Israel was launching a major campaign in Khan Yunis. So the question becomes, well, then what was the Hamas Khan Yunis battalion deputy commander doing in Rafah, pretending to be a journalist, when he should have been in in Khan Yunis directing the forces under his control. And on top of that, he subsequently was evacuated to Qatar for medical treatment through official channels. And nothing and nobody gets into or out of the Egyptian Palestinian crossing point at Rafah without without prior Israeli authorization. And the same is the case for Ismail al-Ghul. He was arrested and detained by the Israeli forces when they invaded Al-Shifa hospital, the famous nuclear reactor of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. And he was, tortured, beaten up, and all the rest of it, and subsequently released. Well, given that Israel has been torturing Palestinians who are not Hamas to death in its interrogation centers, why would they be releasing someone who they know to be a Hamas fighter, a member of the Qassam brigades, posing as a journalist? None of it makes sense. But again, when you have an army of apologists and flunkies who let Israel do the thinking for them and are just waiting for this propaganda to begin spreading it about, we of course complain about Russian agitprop and Chinese agitprop, but we love Israeli agitprop. We love it. We wait for it with anticipation. So, that's what's going on here. But there is one more element I would like to know, because it's not just about Al Jazeera. An important reason that Israel is targeting and murdering on a scale unprecedented in modern armed conflict, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, is because these are the only journalists that are there. It is systematically preventing any other correspondence, whether Arab or European or North American or Asian or African or what. No one is allowed in. And the problem is, you don't often hear the international media even remind us that they are being systematically excluded from entering the Gaza Strip by the Israelis. And so, in that context, these are the only people there. These are the only journalists reporting from the ground. And I'm sure at some level, Israel believes that if it can pick off a few very well-known, prominent correspondents who are, beamed into every Arab household on a daily basis, maybe then, the freelancers and others will think twice about preserving their own skin and leave the profession or find better things to do until this genocidal campaign comes to an end. But I think it is an extraordinary testament to the Palestinian press corps in the Gaza Strip, particularly of Al Jazeera, but for that matter, anyone else, that they they have not abandoned the profession. In fact, they have redoubled their dedication to informing the world about what is really going on in the Gaza Strip. It's an extraordinary story of courage, of dedication, of professionalism, and one we have to add that will never, ever, ever be properly acknowledged by the propagandists and hacks posing as politicians. Hacks posing as journalists in the Western mainstream media.
Indeed, and this is something we have seen consistently. I mean, you will recall back in towards I think it's the end of October last year, you saw on the front page of the Jerusalem Post pictures of Palestinian Gaza, and many of them journalists, bloggers, vloggers being held up as Hamas, and you could sort of see what was going to happen there. Um, and so this is not just something they did recently;
You
it's something
know,
they've been planning to do for a long time.
you know,
Um, but yeah.
again, if Israel were to tell these people the moon is made out of cheese, probably half these journalists would then send a serious request to the Israeli military spokesman, asking whether it is Gouda or Roquefort. Hopeless.
Well, if NASA disagrees, NASA will be classed as Hamas. But we do have to move on now because we've got, in the last few days, we've seen multiple attacks on schools and hospitals, including two schools in Sheikh Radwan neighborhood in Gaza City, which, the death toll currently is somewhere up in a region of 30 people were killed, but that number could change. And there was also Al Aqsa Hospital, which was struck by Israel, and that was just in the last few days. And indeed, since July 2024, UNRWA has reported that there's been 70% of schools in Gaza have been struck by Israel. But we seem to be seeing, something of an increase as time goes on in the attacks on
Yes.
schools and hospitals. What do you account for this rise?
The normalization of terror, the normalization of genocide. It's unfortunately that simple. Um, Israel, and I think it's a little different than others in its class, if you will. Israel, because external support and public acquiescence is of strategic importance to Israel, if you were to compare it to virtually any other country. It tends to proceed carefully with these matters. It doesn't just go in and flatten an entire uh, territory in the space of an afternoon, the way, let's say, the Americans would do in Vietnam. Um, it proceeds gradually. It'll push a bit at the door, then it'll wait to see what the reaction is. Is there any pushback? No. Then it will push a little harder. And if there's still no pushback, only then will it kick the door in and, spray bullets on anyone and everything on the other side. Israel has always escalated initially gradually and then full out. And so what we have seen in the Gaza Strip is, Israel carries out an attack on a school. Its apologists and flunkies, they don't see the dead children, the beheaded civilians, and so on. No, they see the invisible Hamas commanders who were supposedly there. That's all they see. Um, and and when Israel finds that it's so easy to maintain the support of the United States and other Western governments simply by saying it was Hamas, it was Hamas, it was Hamas, well, then it understands that these kinds of mass killings and atrocious war crimes have been normalized, have been legitimized, and then it begins attacking hospitals, schools, designated safe zones, and so on, half the time without even going through the motions of providing a pretext or excuse for doing so. That's how this has worked. And what we've seen now is an intensification on the bombing of designated refugee center. And of course, if there is any challenge to its actions, it'll say it was Hamas. Well, the argument that Israel has made is that Hamas has chosen to hide assets in civilian structures because it knows that Israel, the most moral army in the solar system, will not attack such targets out of an extraordinary care for the sanctity of Palestinian life. If Hamas genuinely believed that placing its assets in schools and hospitals would protect them from Israeli military attack, if it genuinely believed that, it wouldn't exist anymore, because there has been a pattern of systematic attacks on schools, hospitals, civilian objects, and so on, not since October 7th, going back years, if not decades. And so a Hamas strategy to seek to protect its military assets by placing them in such sites would have been an absolute failure and would have resulted in the elimination of all those assets. But in the Western mainstream media, to Western government officials, to the army of flunkies and apologists, all you need to say is Hamas and it's a done deal.
Indeed. And my last question, turning to the matters of the actual death toll, the Gaza Health Ministry has updated their death toll in Gaza, and it says since 7th of October 2023, the death toll has now reached 39,623 and about 91,469 injuries. However, as many people have said, the actual real death toll is likely to be much higher. And if we consider the sort of wide-scale destruction of Gaza, displacement, and all of these sorts of things, I mean, historically, the health ministry has been a very reliable source of statistics and information. Yes. But of course, now they're in a situation where everyone has been displaced, lots of things have been destroyed, things have been moved around. And so getting the accurate level of information to a point where you're comfortable releasing it is much more limited now than it was back in October. So with all of that in mind, how are the dead being counted?
Yes, I mean, as I'm glad you mentioned that the Gaza Health Ministry, which of course we have to refer to as what is it, the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza, just as of course whenever we speak of the U.S. Health Ministry in the United States in COVID, as you know, every mainstream journalist always refer to it as the MAGA-run U.S. Health Ministry. And just as we always, of course, referred to the Tory-run NHS in the UK, you know, we since that is how we describe such institutions in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in Europe, that is the only reason that we're now referring to the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry. I digress. It's just something that I find rather outrageous because, you know, the Gaza, while Hamas controls political power in the Gaza Strip, um, the health ministry does not recruit its specialists and officials from the Hamas movement. These are properly qualified medical and health professionals, some of whom I am sure um, uh, are members of Hamas, and some of whom I am sure detest Hamas, just as in the NHS. I am sure you have members, staff who think Nigel Farage is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and others you know, who think he should fall overboard from his yacht. But anyway, so um, the health ministry, as you noted, has been repeatedly determined to be a fully reliable source, including, I should add, by Israeli intelligence. But of course, you know, next to Israeli intelligence relying on its statistics, you know, not only for purposes of genocidal planning, but also others. Then, of course, you have the Israeli government um, uh, basically saying, you know, the Hamas-run health ministry, it's completely unreliable. You know, Netanyahu in the U.S. Congress got a standing ovation for saying not a single civilian was killed in Rafah. Imagine, imagine some, you know, neo-Nazi getting a standing ovation for saying not a single Jew was killed in the Holocaust. It's beyond words. But um, so Israeli government puts out these statements challenging the health ministry and its statistics. And then, of course, you get its army of flunkies and apologists who let Israel do their thinking, then start spreading all this propaganda about Pallywood and all the rest of it. But again, I digress out of frustration, and I do want to get back to your question. My understanding is that the Gaza Health Ministry will only record a casualty um, if that individual is actually confirmed. In other words, a parent brings a dismembered child to a Palestinian hospital or health clinic. Someone brings in a parent or a spouse, and they are able to provide staff at those facilities with the name and identification number of the casualty, whether killed or wounded. And only then is that individual entered into the statistics of that are presented by that are published by the health ministry. The Gaza Media Office, from what I understand, operates according to different standards. It accepts reports, for example, of, you know, let's say a journalist is at a site and says that he has confirmed that 15 people were killed in a particular bombing. We don't know their names. We don't know their identity numbers. We may never even find their bodies buried under the rubble, those would be included in the media office's statistics. They would not be considered confirmed casualties by the Ministry of Health because they need the personal identifying information. And of course, the health ministry is operating under impossible circumstances. First of all, it has diminished human capacity, because its own staff are being attacked and targeted and in many, severely overworked. They have less means and resources at their disposal. So, and the entire health infrastructure of the Gaza Strip, of course, has been systematically targeted for thorough obliteration. And that explains the inconsistency. Also, when you look at the situation on the ground, there are thousands of corpses of Palestinians buried under the rubble, virtually all of whom, unfortunately, must be considered dead, and many of whom will never even be found. Advanced states of decomposition, movement of rubble by Israeli bulldozers, and we've seen numerous images of Israel simply scooping up bodies and tossing them wherever. People, dying at home and being buried at home, and those cases not being reported to any medical facility. So, yeah, sure. Think of 39,000, however hundred, as a Hollywood exaggeration, if you will, but recognize that the current actual number of casualties is most likely already at least twice as high as what is being reported by the Gaza Health Ministry. And when you take into account what else we don't know about, and when you take into account what we should reasonably expect on a conservative basis, as recently published in the British medical journal, The Lancet, we're not talking about thousands or tens of thousands. We're talking about hundreds of thousands. Palestinians killed in this genocidal campaign by Israel in the Gaza Strip.
Maureen, it's a great pleasure to bring you on and to talk to us about all of these issues. But we have now
Very much.
Come to the end of our time. So thank you for talking to us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And to our audience, thank you for tuning in. Please do tune in next week for more Memo in Palestine this week with will be Nassim Ahmed and Moin Rabbani. Thank you very much.